Hello and welcome to From There to Here, the podcast where we get real about what it takes to build a new life far from home. I'm your host, Emma Bellamy, and today my guest is Mish Kumar-Jonson, a mental health social worker, psychotherapist, and advocate with over 15 years of experience in trauma-informed care. In this episode, they unpack some of the most important issues migrants face, from code switching and the pressure to be grateful, to the complexities of belonging and the responsibility placed upon them to integrate. As a neurodivergent, non-binary, queer BIPOC immigrant, Mish brings a unique perspective to this conversation. I've learned a lot through our exchange, and I hope you will too. Okay, let's dive in. Mishma Kumar-Jonson, I'm delighted to have you on the show. You were recommended to me by a previous guest, Niharika Ayermath. She mentioned on the show that you would be a great guest to interview, so I'm glad that we are finally making this happen.
Right. Thank you so much. Niharika is a dear friend and a wonderful colleague. And I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the unceded lands of the Wairarong, Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation. Just pay my respects to elders past and present. We are obviously having this chat during Reconciliation Week. And, we're talking about things like cultural identity and movement. And I think we have so much to learn from First Nation community. So really wanting to pay my respects and acknowledge the deep wisdom in those cultures. I'm just really grateful for the opportunity to come and chat with you today.
Yay. So, Mishma, you are an interesting migrant to get insights from because you've experienced multiple migrations. You've lived in India, Oman, France, America, New Zealand, and Australia. So I'm curious to hear the story behind your cultural identity journey. I imagine that with each of these migrations, your sense of identity, your sense of who you are changed to some extent.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had the privilege of the multiple migrations, as you talked about, and it's really interesting because there's, forced displacement and forced migration that happens, but then there's also this thing of, oh, my family moved, so I have to move. It's not so much forced, but your family moves, so you move, and then you get older, and then you might have this, say, economic migration because you think it'll be better for your future and stuff like that. And my family at some point was forcibly displaced, but I in my life was not. But just the learnings that I bring from that intergenerational sense of that cultural identity, because I'm a very proud South Indian person, and being a South Indian person in France is very different to being a South Indian person in Melbourne, different to being a South Indian person in Swana, all known as the Middle East. And so it's not only that I had different pieces of the puzzle come together for my cultural identity, it also meant what did those cultural identities in those different contexts also mean, right? All of that is moving and all of that is fluid. And there are things in this world that you sometimes can't put words to, but you can only feel. And I think my biggest cultural identity that I've brought along in all this journey is that we can actually connect to each other on a human by human basis if we can find that we have more in common than we not. There's so much space for us to have community together is kind of what I've learned through all of those different cultural identities and movements.
So it's finding the parts of yourself that can connect to the personality, the collective personality that you encounter in a given country.
Yeah, for sure, because they're also coming with their own authentic experiences and their own intergenerational stories and their own versions of joy. And, there's a sense of, well, my joy looks like this. Can I invite you into that? There's such a beautiful way of, you might go into people's homes or, come in for a cup of coffee or a small bite to eat. And there are some ways we just connect as human beings anywhere in the world, but then you get to share hey, there are these other parts of me that are really cool. I prepare food like this, or my music that I've learned sounds like this, or the art or culture, or whatever that is. And just being able to see that through different lenses and through different stories has been really magical and really hard as well. It's not all kind of rainbows and unicorns. People have some really difficult stories. However, what I've been able to do with my own cultural identity and my own multiple migrations is just see that the world is bigger than our own little lives. But sometimes we forget that and we think we're in the middle of the universe and just forget that there's a whole world out there that's still happening. And yeah, I've just had the privilege of being able to see different people's story.
So there is a challenge that I find particularly interesting as a migrant to navigate is code switching. And I know that you've experienced this. So can you talk a bit more about how it was like for you to have the pressure to code switch depending on the context that you navigate?
Yeah, for sure. And I still code switch. When I'm speaking to my mum, I have quite a thick Indian accent. And, when I was in France, I had quite a thick French accent. And, code switching kind of comes in all sorts of way. But also, I think sometimes we forget that cultural identity is not just talking about race, it's also talking about other cultures. So, as a queer person, the LGBTIQA plus communities has such rich, beautiful culture and such rich, beautiful stories, right? Historical and intergenerational stories. And code switching from those cultures is also a thing that happens. I'm also a neurodivergent person, and then having to code switch to be, more accepted or understood in a neurotypical world. I'm also a disabled person. I'm a non-binary person. So when we're talking about code switching, it's almost constant, if that makes sense. It's not just, oh, now I'm talking to someone different or I'm in a different place. So I'm code switching. It's a constant. Are you a safe person? Can I show up authentically? Do I have to present myself or talk or say things in a particular way so that you go, okay, you're not a threat to me, that you understand that we can have an authentic connection outside of those biases is exhausting. It's frankly, exhausting. And at the same time, is really necessary for people to find safety and connection and to navigate a world that can be deeply biased or easy to, sort people into categories of you sound like this, you look like this, therefore you believe this, when we know that's not true.
I like what you say. I think it's a smart thing to be able to do because society requires it of you. But at the same time, there is a loss that comes from it. It's a loss of parts of who you are that you cannot express, that are not safe to claim in a context. So I don't know whether it's a good or a bad thing, but I guess it's like both at the same time.
Yeah, 100%. And there's this thing around, there are some people who talk about attachment versus authenticity. And as human beings, we have two needs. We have a need to attach and form societies and connections and families and communities. But there's also another need, which is around authenticity and around authentic connections, but also expressions of being able to show up authentically and know what you feel. Because, like anything, it's a muscle. And if the muscle that you're constantly exercising or practicing is the attachment muscle, sometimes you forget how to practice that authenticity muscle and it can atrophy a little bit, right? And that's why sometimes you get the us versus them, because there's a sense of, well, I can't be authentic in these and I have to choose attachment because without attachment, can't do anything. I can't live in a society. So, in some ways, yes, a loss of parts, but also this sense of it prioritizes attachment and means I always have to self-abandon or always have to self-sacrifice authenticity in order to prioritize attachment. And with my mental health hat on, sometimes I think we talk a lot about attachment wounding, but don't always talk about authenticity wounding. And it's something that, I support people to explore a lot. And it's in my own cultural identity. There was a lot of authenticity wounding due to racism and, and all of that in Australia and different parts of the world. Not all of you is accepted and celebrated. I think that makes sense.
Give me an example of your life.
of my life.
Perhaps in Australia could be a nice one to discuss.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I spent about 5 or 6 years in Ballarat, which is a regional town on Kulin Nation land. And it was really interesting when I moved there, there weren't that many people of the global majority, so people of color, especially not that many Indian people. And the only time I would ever see Indian people would be when they were working. So whether that be working in Indian restaurants or, very specific context was the only time I saw Indian people. And so when I was going to university in Ballarat, there was this sense of, oh, you're going to go get a job as a taxi driver or you're going to go work at an Indian restaurant. And every time I would walk into work, I used to have a job at a pub or a bar, and there'd be a racist comment that was said as a joke every single day. So, I'd walk into work and they'd be like, there's the register, don't hurt us, just take the till, and I was like, what is happening? And for the longest time, I would play into that because for me, it had to be a code switch of, oh, it's not safe to be a person of the global majority. I almost have to, I can't be authentic here. I need this job. I'm, trying to go to university. There's not many opportunities in Ballarat for me to have that. And it's really interesting around the racism because it's this thing of, oh, you're laughing along, so it's fine. And it's like, no, I'm choosing safety. I'm choosing to keep my job. I think that's where there's that sense of you can't always be authentic. And that really hurts, because you're like, I can't actually change this about myself. I can't change being Indian. And I love being Indian. I love being South Indian, as a person, because there's so many stories and traditions that are really beautiful that I've been able to now engage with and now connect with. And so that was one example. And there were so many in regional Victoria around how you have to choose attachment over authenticity. Does that kind of make sense to you? Or
It does. I really like what you shared. There is another point that I think is really important to talk about. It's the gratefulness, the pressure that many migrants feel to, show up with a positive facade, and sometimes at the expense of their true feelings, their true struggles. Is it something that you have experienced that you see other migrants experiencing?
when you migrate to this country, there is such a deep sense of Australia so much better than where you came from. And therefore, you should be super grateful for being here, And I've actually had people say, oh, isn't it so much better here than in India? And I'm like, no, actually, there are some parts of India where it's actually so much better in India. There are so many things in India I wish I had here, And just this constant, oh, you must be so grateful. I'm like, actually not grateful to be here. Or there's also a sense of you can't be critical of society or the way things are done here because the sense of, well, then just leave, go back to where you came from if you don't like how things are done here. And there's this real protection of what is Australian or what, our culture. And there was a quote the other day by a minister that says, they were quoting a specific value, and I think it was that Australian values, and Australians seem to have forgotten that. And again, it's this thing of we live in a time capsule and we want to live in a time capsule and we don't want to move away from that. And you need to be grateful that we accepted you into our beautiful little time capsule, and you're like, there's a whole other world out there that is moving on, but also I don't need to be grateful to be here. Like, yes, okay, I'm here and all of that, but there are inherent things that I bring and so many other migrants bring that that gratitude doesn't go the other way. It always feels like the migrant has to be really grateful and thank you. But Australia itself or the country or communities don't have to be grateful for the migrants. And we saw it in COVID when so many people had to leave and did leave. There was such a loss. There was such a crater of identity that was lost. But I don't think it's shifted anything. It was still like migrants have to be really grateful, but Australia doesn't have to be grateful to migrants. That's I find that a really interesting, yeah. interesting piece.
And also, Australians have the privilege of not being grateful about their own country when we don't, right? I think that they can criticize their country and be completely fine with it. There isn't the come back to where you are from, right? Even though they are migrants from generations ago.
Absolutely. And I actually had a man come up to me once. I was swimming at a beach with a friend and we were in the water, and it was, for once, it was warm and, enough to go in the water. And it was quite late at night. And I remember him coming up, and already we were a bit weary because, we were two people and this man was coming over and then he was trying to make conversation. He said, "So where are you from?" Which is not a question I enjoy, because I feel like the question is not so much where are you from, but asking what kind of brown are you? That's what I really feel like they're asking. And anyway, so me very cheekily, I said, "Oh, I'm just from Melbourne." And he was like, "No, no, no, where are you really from?" And I was like, "Oh, from Glenroy." And, going to it, and he was like, "No, no, no. Like, where are you really from?" I was like, "Oh, I don't feel comfortable giving you my address." And, at this point, I thought he'd just leave it. And he said, "No, you see, my family are true blue Aussies. We have been here for 6 generations. So where were you born?" And I was like, "Oh, in a hospital, probably same as you." Like, it's just such a ridiculous thing to ask, right? But this thing of like, "No, I belong here, whereas you are just welcome here." And even that thing of like, well, 6 generations still doesn't mean you're from here. It just means that you migrated a little bit before me. That's all that means, right? But this sense of like, "Oh, but now I'm Australian and you're not yet there." But when you become a true blue Aussie and 6 generations are here, then you're good enough to be here, which is such rubbish, because since when did we start putting in this hierarchy of 2 years means not good enough, 3 years not good enough, or like this generation? And it's just really interesting how embedded that is within the society here.
It raises the question as to what constitutes Australianness. At which point can we consider someone to be Australian? Is it the citizenship, or is it a set of values, and what are those values? Because I feel that there is as well so much diversity in Australia. And I find that when people don't experience migrants as being Australian, it's weird because I'm not sure whether they know what Australian means either.
No, absolutely. And I actually have a really good example of that. When I was living in the United States, there was just a person that I was talking to one day, and they said, "Oh, again, favorite question, where are you from?" And I said, "Oh, I'm Australian." And I was quite young then, but nonetheless, still a shit stirrer. And they were like, "Australia, you can't be." And I said, "Oh, why?" I have the accent. I have, I call everyone mate. What more do you want? Like, and I shorten everything and add an O in it. I'll say Arvo and Servo and or Bottle-O. And they were like, "No, no, no, because there are only white people in Australia." And I was like, "Oh, okay. Well, one, no, because, First Nation folk, not quite white." So that was, and it was just so interesting that how many ever people, whoever I would say to you I was Australian, there would just be this real puzzled look of, "Oh, but you can't be." And so many people would say, "Are you sure you're not Mexican?" Like, "No, I'm pretty confident." Actually, and just that sense of, not only is there a sense of what is Australian and we might not know, but also the global perception of what an Australian is very much this surfer, blonde, blue eye, tall, loves the sun, kind of larrikin, drinks a lot, says whatever. And it's really hard because so many of us are not that. Right. And even Australian values of mateship or whatever it is, I don't actually think it's that, because I think so many migrants are so incredibly invested in community and mateship and have been doing that for eons and a half. But as soon as you do that here, it's seen as, "Oh, that's a weird thing. Why you trying to get to know me deeply. There'll be a lot of superficial relationships, but not deep relationships. So even in that, in those values that are touted or are put to the rest of the world, we are these happy-go-lucky, easy, larrikin, get to know us. Like, well, not really, because we will actually, I just find it's really hard to make deep relationships here.
You know, this, it makes me think of a metaphor that Erin Meyer uses. She's a cultural expert, and she distinguishes between coconut cultures and peach cultures. And so coconut cultures are more like in France, where there is a harder shell to break in. But once you do, it's soft, embracing, you get to really know who people are. Peach cultures are soft and super friendly. Hey, how are you? But then there is this hard seed that is impenetrable, that you can never really fully grasp, because there isn't this I don't know if it's sense of authenticity. Perhaps there is a bit of shyness around sharing feelings or your authentic self. But yeah, it's an interesting distinction how some cultures that don't necessarily appear friendly can actually be more friendly than other cultures that appear at first value very friendly.
Absolutely. And I think it also comes back to intentionality. I wonder if to use the metaphor that you were just saying, the peach is there. So it's like, don't touch the seed. It's like, don't go anywhere near the seed, have the peach, have the fruit, but this is me, or this is my whatever. And then in other cultures, it's like, you got to work a little bit, but when you work and you prove and whatever, you'll be embraced. And I just find here, as a country or a colonial, project, because I think as a society, we haven't really grappled with what we continue to do to First Nation folk, how we continue to colonize and how that continues to show up. There's also a sense of we don't want to go too deep, because when you get too deep, Australians don't like talking about shit, right? We've employed a couple of counselors and psychologists and social workers from overseas. And when I'm doing the orientation with them, I'll say, this is not Europe. People won't just say things to you. I grew up in Europe for a long time. And if people thought something, they'd just say something, right? In Europe, a lot of people just say what they're thinking. Whereas here, you have to it's like playing chess or checkers. If I say this, then they might say this, and then I say this, and then, and you're like both trying to do this thing just to get to it. And it can be such a culture shock, because it's like you're having three simultaneous conversations, and you have to like read between the lines to understand what they're saying. And it's really interesting here, but I don't think we've actually grappled with what is truth telling, what is holding space for different perspectives, what it just as a society, I think. So it's hard on an individual level to do that when you don't really know who you are as a society as well.
Yeah, it's a good point. Empathy, and perhaps more accurately, the lack of empathy towards migrants. You drew an interesting parallel with the double empathy problem, which is basically something that originated from the autistic literature, if I understand it well. So we challenged the assumption that only autistic people were unable to have empathy towards non-autistic people, but this is a two-way difficulty where non-autistic people also struggle to empathize with autistic people, because empathy is selective. It's a lot easier to empathize with someone that you can identify with, that you relate to. So yeah, please share a bit more about that, because I think it's an interesting point.
I think the interesting thing also about the autistic community, and I'm an autistic person, is that you meet one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. Every single autistic person is different. And even in that sense of, not only is it a bi-directional misunderstanding or lack of empathy that happens, because I actually don't know what it's like to be a neurotypical person. And I have such a good example of this. Is the other day, Niharika actually and I were in a meeting, and I was talking to the person. He was online, and the person who Niharika and I were meeting with joined a little bit early, maybe like a minute or two earlier, and then Niharika joined, and we said the hello. And I said, okay, let's go. So this is what I'm thinking, blah, 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 blah. And after the phone call, the Erica was like, we should have maybe spent some time just introducing ourselves to each other. And I was like, I don't give a fuck. Like, what does it matter? I just want to get to the point. And what's really great is having people like Niharika around me who's like, no, that was great. Like, thanks. Because I also sometimes, don't do well with the fluff. But where the bi-directional lack of empathy becomes a problem is when the onus of something going well or something being safe or that interaction being quote unquote successful is wholly placed on the made marginalized community. So within the example of where you said with the autistic community, the holistic, which is people who are not autistic, the holistic community also has an empathy problem, right, on both sides. But the onus of communication or a situation or relationship going well is wholly placed on the autistic person because it is seen that the holistic person's way of navigating the world, way of approaching anything is correct. And the autistic person's way of doing everything is wrong, right? And when you look at that double empathy problem, I think it's very similar for migrants and people who migrate here because there's a sense of your migration journey, I can't understand as someone who's not a migrant, just say, like, right? And perhaps people who are migrants might not be able to understand someone who's not left Australia and not migrated elsewhere. And, that double empathy problem there. However, the onus of safety in or relationship or whatever is solely placed on migrants. And you see that so much in the way that Australians interact. So I found in many other cultures, you can go out and meet people in social settings, where in Australia, it's really hard to because everyone goes out in their cliques. So in order for a migrant to join a group, it is solely placed on them, that responsibility to join society. But I find a lot of Australians will not actually create spaces where they call in, migrants and say, hey, I will put in the effort to meet you halfway so that we can both create that relationship. Does that make sense? Like the onus of connection is almost always placed on the migrant person. And even though both of them can't understand what the other one's experience might be, and therefore coming into it with different perspectives and different ways of navigating and connecting, but the onus is always placed on the migrant, or almost always.
Mm-mm. Yeah, the adaptation needs to come from the migrant, but there isn't really a willingness from the locals to adapt to the migrant experience as well. And that's such a good point.
And, there are some beautiful, really, really beautiful organizations. One's called the Welcome Dinners. The founder of the Welcome Dinners was this woman who was working with the migrant community, and the people she was working with said, oh, I didn't know about that, or, whatever. And she said, wow, you've been here for so long, and how come you knew? And this person goes, because I've never been inside an Australian person's home before. And this person said, what do you mean you've never been inside a Australian person's home before? And then they said, well, who's inviting us? Where are we getting these invites? And so she created this welcome dinners or lunches or community dinners where it would be, say, X amount of people who are newly arrived Australians and X amount of people who are established Australians, and they come together for a lunch or a dinner, and everyone brings a meal and shares something about their culture. And because research has shown the more people are connected, the more that migration journey and experience is not only not traumatic, but is held and, beautiful and quote unquote successful. But again, the onus is always placed on the migrant. And so she created this project, and I had the privilege and just the joy of being part of that for a while and facilitating those dinners. And just seeing people come together and going, we're actually far more alike than I thought. There are actually people in my neighborhood who think similarly to me, just in little different ways, and the onus of that or the responsibility of that happening or going well was not placed on migrants. And so if that pressure was taken away, we just saw such beautiful connections happening. And so I do think it's possible, but not if we only ever place the responsibility on migrants to join society or join community and also do the work of being welcomed and also doing the work of, being a migrant itself.
I love it. I wish that some initiatives like that existed when I arrived here, because it took me so many years to have friends here. It was so hard because it's really hard to penetrate a clique, to penetrate a group that is already established, and you're a bit different, you're funny, and it's fun at a superficial level, but they don't really follow up with you, when you arrive. Mm-mm.
Yeah, 100%. And especially so if there's a multifaceted cultural identity. So within, say, if you're someone who's part of the LGBTIQA plus community, it's like, okay, there's a thriving LGBTIQA plus community here. Great. But I'm also a person of the global majority as a person of color. And it's like, oh, okay. All right. Well, you can either have the queer communities or you can have the people of color communities. Kind of choose one. And that, it's kind of like those intersectional communities sometimes can be not only hard to find, but can also feel othering or othered in those. And say you're someone who has a religious and cultural identity tied to religion and also a queer person, that intersectionality is really hard to find and really hard to navigate. And all of these things of, okay, we have it's kind of like we've ticked the box. Do we have the queer community? Do we have the people of the global majority? Do we have this community? Do we have that? Okay, you're all good, great, off you go. And it's like, hang on, people are actually not silos. We don't exist in these perfect little boxes. I am a little bit of this community and a little bit of this one and a little bit of this one and a little bit of this one. Where do I go? And it's like, well, can you just split yourself? And when you're in this community, just ignore all these others and then go to this one and ignore all the others and all parts of yourself. And that can be really disheartening because often people want to find a space where they can go where all of them is seen, right? And where they don't have to leave parts of themselves at the door, where it's like all of me is welcome here and celebrated and held and appreciated. And I think there's work to be done in that, and we can do better in that.
That makes me think of the point you made when we first met, which is that lack of empathy can also exist within migrant communities. And that's perhaps because there is so much diversity within the migrant community, and even migrants that come from the same country, because your take on the culture might be completely different.
And I often find it really interesting, and I don't know how controversial this take is going to be, but I often find that migrants are often more conservative in the country they've migrated to than the people of that culture outside of that migrant community or that migrant country. I have found some Indians, and I can only speak because of that culture because that's my culture, right? Being a South Indian, are often more conservative here in Australia than they are in South India, back home. Because there's almost this sense of, say, parents came here in the 90s or, early 2000s. It's like their idea of India that they have is almost fixed. And so it's like in order to be an Indian or a good Indian, you have to do all of these things, and that's how you're a good Indian. But India has moved on, right? You don't like India has kind of moved on, that's not what a good Indian is anymore. And so I often find that people who are migrants can sometimes be more conservative and hold on even more so to that culture or that cultural values or identity more than actually in the country. And at the same time, because you're in a country where you are not the majority, you are the minority in that you are still fighting for space and your culture is still seen as one that is exotic or one that is people can take as costumes and play around with and all of this. And I have a good example for this. So when, people are here and they wear saris or salwar kameez or wear bindi or Bengals or whatever that is, people here might say, hang on, that's cultural appropriation, especially not if it's done in a really respectful way, or people might say, hey, I got this from Bangalore, and it's actually giving credit and all of that. Obviously, that's totally fine. But when people wear salwar kameez or like a dupatta, and they're like, oh, this scarf, like it's not a scarf, it's clearly a dupatta, that kind of cultural appropriation. It's really interesting because here there's a sense of don't do that. That's shit. Don't reduce us down to a costume, whatever. But if a white person goes to India and wears those, Indians are like, yeah, this is great. They're embracing our culture. Look at that. Because Indians in India are the majority and the white person is the minority there. So when they come in, it's this thing of like, oh, yeah, let them, it's fine. But here, white people are the majority and South Indians or Indians are the minority. So they have to really fight to not be reduced down to a costume and not be reduced down to a food group or whatever. Even that nuance of having to hold on to your culture when other people see it as a costume or whatever is also a really interesting place to be, and how people then react to that and how they have to find their own way in that, because there's a sense of I'll never be brown enough for the Indian community and I'll never be white enough for the Australian community. But at the same time, my cultural identity is reduced down to these things like food and costumes and dress ups and big weddings and stuff like that. There's so much more nuance within that, depending also on where you live in terms of your cultural identity.
Yeah, so there are two things in what you said. There is the fact that culture is not static, it evolves. So when you migrate, your culture may evolve without you. And you arrive with this ancient way of conceiving and perceiving your culture. And then when you arrive here, you have to assert your cultural identity as a way to reclaim who you are. I often find that, you realize you are South Indian or French in my case, when you arrive in another country and you're like, oh, and being French becomes more important than it would have been if I had not migrated, right? It's the fight for the self or for some cultural aspects of your identity that you hold on to.
Absolutely. And if you say are in relationship with someone who doesn't speak the language or doesn't understand the culture, it's this thing of, again, you're not being fully seen in that and you have to carve out space. And so I'm married to a very, very, very beautiful woman called Michelle, who, it's very funny because I'm Mish and she's Michelle, and it's just like Mish and Michelle, M squared. It's a very cute thing. And she has just embraced South Indianness, and often people will say she's just like an Indian as well. Just she's trying to like learn the language and all of this thing. And one day I said to her, until you learn kind of my language, you won't even understand parts of me, because the way we even think is so different, because I think through that language and through that lens and stuff like that. And I read once someone, and I can't remember unfortunately who it is, but I read and they said, if you are in long-term relationship and you want to spend the rest of your life with the person and they speak a different language, you learn that language. Because if not, you will never fully know them. You will only ever know half of them. And I think that's so true. And that comes back to that internal lack of empathy thing you were talking about before that we touched on. Because even say people who are here, I no longer unfortunately speak Malayalam and Kannada, which are my mother and father tongue. But even that of people going, oh, you don't speak that. Oh, okay. So you're not, it's like you're not Indian or you didn't keep that. And I'm like, again, you have to just like have to find yourself in the nuance of that. And say it is the Indian communities, there's not always a celebration of the LGBTIQA plus communities. Of course, there is in some places for sure. And I'm very privileged to have a parent who has always celebrated that identity and has always been very open with her own family and friends who have often been quite homophobic or transphobic. And for her to go, we're not doing that, not my child, been incredibly protective and incredibly just really beautiful. So I've had that privilege, but not everyone has that. And so you kind of have to choose, am I choosing this community or this community? Am I choosing this relationship or this relationship? Am I like constantly? And so yes, within communities, there's an internal lack of empathy, but also sometimes can happen like internally within yourself as well. Of like, I wish I wasn't queer. Some people will say that, I wish I wasn't queer. because then it'll be easier. And I was like, I'd rather wish that society wasn't like this than wish I wasn't queer, but can you see what I mean? Like that lack of empathy can happen in so many ways.
We internalize the lack of acceptance, I think, that we get from outside. I often feel like, oh, I wish I didn't have an accent, because it would be so much more clear what I say. I would sound smarter, so I often have as well those internal talks about things that made me who I am, are part of my story, but I wish I just could live at the door for specific situations.
Sure. And sometimes I say back to people, if someone say can't, like I had to learn how to say r, because you can't say rance without saying the r, But also in Arabic, there are so many ways like your mouth just has to move and do that. And when someone can't understand an accent or things like that, and there are so many people who come to therapy or just friends who say, I wish I didn't have this accent. And I'll remind them, someone else not understanding your accent is probably a reflection that they haven't learned and understood the way that sounds more than you should be less. Right? It's such an interesting thing how much we put responsibility on ourselves. But I'm like, hang on, their auditory palette is not that wide. So why are you then taking responsibility for their lack of having that in their circle? Because if they had, say, I don't know, a French person in their circle and they just heard that all the time, it wouldn't even be an issue. We place responsibility. I think this is that lack of empathy thing of the double empathy problem thing of like, even we start doing that. The onus of a communication or, conversation going well, we place on ourselves and go, I wish I didn't have the accent, rather than, I wish you could just understand different accents.
Yeah, it's so true. You think about what's wrong with me. How can I be better? How can I adapt better? How can I speak better? But you never think about how can they understand me better? Do they make an effort to understand me better? Are they interested in the fact that I speak more than two languages? So it's so on point with the conversation, the double empathy. Something that I want to talk about with you is that because of the limitations of empathy, in your practice, you encourage people to prioritize compassion over empathy. Can you share a bit more about that?
100%. We at the Iceberg Foundation, which is a mental health charity for the queer, so the LGBTIQA plus and the neurodivergent communities, our core value is compassion over empathy, because there's a sense of, I believe in your experience rather than my interpretation of your experience. I can actually just believe you and just have compassion for your experience. So, for example, there's a beautiful meme of an eagle. There are two eagles having breakfast, right? So I'm going to enact it for you. Two eagles having breakfast. Eagle one is they're reading the paper, right? These are human eagles at this point, reading the paper, having their coffee. And eagle one goes, are you ever bothered by Mr. Owl? And these are both predators, right? Owls and eagles. And eagle two goes, no, Mr. Owl has never bothered me. And then there's this pause for comedic effect. And then eagle one goes, I don't know what Mr. Mouse is on about. And it's like, because owls will never bother eagles, but of course they'll bother mice because they eat mice. So when mice go and say to an eagle, actually, Mr. Owl is a bloody bully, eagles go, no, I've never had an issue with him. Because in that, there's a lack of empathy. I cannot understand, say if I was an eagle, I cannot understand a mouse's point of view because I just can't. We're different lives, right? In the same way, there are some things that white people will never be able to understand my experience as a person of the global majority, or a straight person might never be able to understand. This goes back to that double empathy issue we were talking about. They're just not able to because the world looks different and acts different and is different when you have different cultural identity. And so if empathy is around, I can connect with that and I can really, have that and understand. You can never do that. So part of what we'd say is, I just believe you that it sucks, or it's really great, or it's whatever it is. I just believe what it is for you, and I have compassion for that. That's it. Right? I don't have to have been in your shoes. I don't have to try to imagine what it would be like, because you're just telling me what it's like for you. And even if we went through exactly the same experiences, doesn't mean I will still understand your point of view. And where we see, for example, twins can go through the same household with the same parents and still have very vastly different experiences of life or navigating the world. We understand that that happens. And so I just find it really interesting when we put so much kind of depth or weight in this thing of, if I can connect with it, then I can understand you. Why can't you just believe what the person is saying and just come from a place of compassion? It's like, wow, I will hold this space for your experiences without me having to kind of come in with my own.
I really like it. And I actually looked up the differences between empathy and compassion. And something that stood out for me was that empathy is really about the ability to understand another person's perspective, their feelings, their experience. As we've discussed, it's definitely selective and limited and, depends on your ability to identify with or relate to another person. But compassion is more about the response that arises when someone shares their experience with you and the desire to help. So it's more outward focused. It's not inward focused like empathy is, and it's directed towards action. Like it's recognizing the limits of you being able to understand their perspective and focusing on what you can do for them.
Yes. And, sometimes the doing for them is not doing anything, but just sitting in silence. Right? There are so many times where people might share a story and the other person goes, shit, I don't know what to say. What is the perfect thing to say? And sometimes it's just the silence and going, thank you for sharing. There's actually nothing to say in this moment. I just want you to know that I'm here to support in whichever way. And if that is just sitting in silence or, that's also completely fine. And it doesn't always have to be solutions focused. It can just be hey, here is someone who will listen, and I will have a human response for you. Not a, can I understand what would that be like if I was in that position? Because once we start doing that, we start making these bold assumptions about what this person's life might be or what they might want or their values. Whereas with compassion, it can be, okay, wow, what, that's wild, that's, or whatever that is, and just be in it with them and be present in that.
At the same time, if I'm trying to be the devil's advocate, can we do that without some basic empathy? Because I'm thinking that if we don't have this feeling of or this sense of what this person might have been through, isn't there a greater risk of dehumanizing them? I never know how to say it with the accent.
And you said it perfectly.
Yeah, did I? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what's your point of view on that? Because when that stops, are you dehumanizing them and their experience as well?
It's a great question. And I think it kind of goes back to something we've already talked about around that double empathy problem. Whose responsibility is it for that person to have compassion? It's not always one-sided. So if, for example, I share something with you and you're like, I cannot relate. I no idea what you're talking about. It seems like you're from a different planet. Right? If you have that to me and you're like, I actually don't think we both live in the same planet, what I would then say to you is go expand your horizons, because clearly your point of view of the world is narrower and this person's experience sits outside that. And it's not their job to educate you or expand your horizons for you. It's actually your job to recognize, oh, I don't get it, means I'm missing something. And so I need to put in the work to just expand my horizons so that I can learn more about it or whatever.
Relate.
Does that kind of, relate to it
Yeah.
on a human level, right? On a basic level. So if you look at the trans community, there was someone the other day who said to me, they said, did you know that there are people in the trans community that die? And I was like in general, because trans people are also humans and all humans die. So, just from a biological point of view, that's, it kind of happens. And they were like, no, 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 like it can be really unsafe for them. And I was like, yeah. Have you watched the news lately? Can you see? And they were like, no, because when I watch the news, none of this comes up for me. So what I said to them, I was like, okay, you have noticed a gap in your own understanding of how the world works. And at this moment, you have a couple of choices. You're seeing that the way you thought the world works is being challenged. It's up to you now to go and learn more about it, listen to the voices. I gave them a few people to follow, read about, listen to, look more into. Now, that's their choice if they want to do that, or continue to be like, nah, that's not the world, or this half-half thing that some people do. Of course, this person might never be able to relate, perhaps, to the trans community. However, they might be able to relate to the fact that the world is not always safe for everyone. Just like basic human things come back to. And I'm hoping that they go away and look and listen and unlearn and relearn and all of these things to come back to, oh my God, life sucks for trans people. But there's also incredible joy in the trans community, and trans joy is euphoric. It can be really beautiful. Can you see what I'm saying? In the sense of, yes, on a basic level, there might not be that relatability, but you can change that. There is a responsibility that can be placed on the person to say, okay, you've noticed a gap, off you pop, go do some research.
Get sensitive to their experience. I don't know why. It makes me think of, I saw a reel the other day of a guy who dressed as a female, like he was quite androgynous in his features. And so when dressed as a female, like there were hours and hours of makeup to make him look like a very attractive lady. And he looked stunning, right? And so he was walking the street and he spent the entire day dressed as this very beautiful woman. And the way the men were behaving, it made him feel very unsafe. And at the end, you have an interview with the guy saying, look, I had no idea. And I wish more people were doing that with other different communities that they cannot relate to.
100%. And this is where I come back to using privilege to make space for. And there was a great example around whiteness and how to use your privilege of whiteness to fight against racism and racist interactions, where people say, if you're a white person, use your privilege to call out stuff, because you're more likely to be listened to than the person of the global majority, right? As a Black person or Indigenous person or person of color. And in the same way, just say that this person dressed as a woman for one day and felt unsafe, but then can go back to his usual life. It can just be oh yeah, I remember that one day. It's very different when that has been your life before you were even born, right? But this is what I mean. This person can never understand what it's like to be a woman, but he can perhaps spend his life being curious, but also acknowledging that he's not going to know, and then believing, and then using his privilege to create safe-ish and safe enough environments. You see what I mean? Like, I don't think the goal is to be able to understand everyone, because it's not possible. But I do think it is around using privilege and using power to be able to create spaces where communities can self-determine. Now, women don't need this man to become a woman to, understand them if nothing is going to change. If he's not going to hold other men accountable. Now he just knows that the world is unsafe for women for one day, and then what does it change, right? But if he uses his privilege to go, no, I know how unsafe it is. How can I just be a part of creating safer places, safer women, or whatever that is? it can still go a long way.
It makes me think of so many people on social media when they see racism as example, they will say, oh, not all white people are like that. Or when they see misogynism and they're going to say, oh, not all men do this, and it's like really denying the fact that it is a systemic issue. And it's not really about the fact that not all men or not all white are like that.
I just come back to the Maltesers metaphor. Have you heard of the Maltesers metaphor?
No, I don't think so.
If you're eating a box of Maltesers, like the little chocolate things, and you're eating away, and then someone says to you, oh, 2 of the Maltesers in there are actually rabbit shit covered in chocolate. But not all Maltesers. Not all Maltesers. So don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Not all. You're going to be a little bit worried. You're going to perhaps approach every single Malteser with a healthy level of skepticism and worry because you don't want to eat shit, literally. So not all Maltesers, sure, but enough. It's that sense of, again, why can't we just believe being unsafe is problematic and that's it? And why can't we create spaces that is safe enough for people to exist in without having to go, but I don't experience this. Yeah. Okay. That doesn't actually change anything in anyone's life if you say not all men. Great. Status quo kept. Amazing. Well done.
I love this metaphor. I've never heard of it, but I love it. It's such a good point. And it makes me think that truly encountering another person requires the ability to give up on the need to understand them, to make their experience yours. It's more about accepting that they are ungraspable, that you may never understand what they are going through. But yeah, believing them anyway. And I think that the belief part is really interesting. I never really thought of compassion about just believing, not experiencing the same things. It's interesting. Another point that I think is interesting in your practice is that you encourage people to invest in joy rather than trauma, rather than the difficulties that they are facing. Why is that?
I love talking about this. I come back to the way so many societies have endured and have continued, and especially First Nation communities here and Black communities. There is so much healing that is done in dancing and singing and being together that is outside of therapy or colonial ways of quote unquote healing, right? And we've done this for eons. Eons. It's not anything new, singing, dancing, or whatever. And I think somewhere along the lines, capitalism has forced us to look at things like that through the lens of profitability. Human beings just need to be able to move their body and sing and cry and feel and chant and scream and stomp and dance, and that's needed. That's a really integral part of how we move through the world. And when we look at how we approach trauma or how we approach difficulty, there's this sense of we need to tackle it and we need to center it. Martin Luther King said, you can't drive out darkness with darkness. If you're trying to light up a room and it's really dark, you don't bring in more darkness to try to make it, like, it doesn't make sense, right? You bring in light. And in the same way, I'm not saying that we don't address trauma or we don't acknowledge that there's deep difficulty in our bones. That's not what I'm saying, and in our muscles. What I'm saying is joy is such a way to center healing rather than only ever centering trauma. And when we center trauma, so the questions of what happened to you that shouldn't have happened to you and what didn't happen to you that should have happened for you, what about what went right? What is going right with you? What are the strengths and the stories you hold from your ancestors that have allowed you to be where you are today? What how do you find joy? Because joy is also a muscle, and unless we exercise it, to use that metaphor, it's going to atrophy. A lot of people, when they're looking for healing, are looking for the ability to reconnect with joy. However, it's kind of saying, I want to go to the gym and, I don't know, be able to do 10 pull-ups, but I have a really weak back. And what we would say is, well, start with pull-ups. If you want to go to pull-ups, start with pull-ups. Even if you can't do it well, use all of these different aids, use the bands, use different weights, use the machines and stuff, but actually move towards the pull-up. You see what I mean? And when it's joy, there's a sense of, after I'm completely healed and all my traumas are addressed, then I will start moving to joy. And it's like, well, okay, but we're still centering trauma. We're not moving towards joy. Joy just gets further and further and further away, rather than that's the healing bit, right? Joy is the way we connect to each other. We connect to ourselves. That's the muscle we build in order to say, I am choosing. Yes, there's the trauma, but I'm also choosing to grow this muscle. And two things can be true at the same time. It can be true that there's deep hurt and deep trauma and deep distress and difficulty navigating the world. And at the same time, I can start to grow my muscle of joy. And so when it does come around, I can learn to recognize it rather than seeing it as a red flag or something that's really scary. Because when there is trauma and distress, joy can actually be seen as a really scary thing or as something that is deeply dangerous, right? If we're trying to not get hurt. And so even when joy comes around, sometimes we see it as danger if we haven't engaged with it enough for it to not look like a danger.
Give me an example. I'm struggling to understand how joy can be perceived as a danger.
Right. I have a great example. Say you have a relationship in which the person was really shit, right? And you've been really impacted by this relationship and you broke up and, it can be really, really distressed. And you start a relationship with someone else, but they're a really lovely person. And they start doing things that feel really uncomfortable. They say things and you're like, why are you saying that? Do you not think I can do it? And they're like, oh, I'm just asking because I just wanted to know like what that's like for you. One of the things that often comes up is someone go, oh, are you using that? And the person goes, why? Do you not think I'm going to put it away? Because perhaps in another relationship, that was seen. And they go, no, I was just going to put it away if you weren't going to. And it's this thing of why, just the suspicion that comes up, why they're doing that, why they're saying that. Because joy has not been there or kindness and care has not been given, when it does come around, it's really difficult to recognize is exactly what it is because we're still holding what happened. Again, not to say that we don't, address what happened. That is absolutely something we do. However, when joy muscles are atrophied, we can see it as suspicious or something that's dangerous.
It's linked as well to the trauma bond. All right. When you are trauma bonded, you tend to see other relationships through that lens of the past traumatic relationship. And you are unable to see that this is a great behavior, a great person that you have here that could give you a lot of joy. Is that it? Or
Yeah, but it's a protection, right? Of like you're trying to protect yourself from the world and you needed that. And that would have been a really, really great, clever way of protecting yourself by seeing the red flags. And what our brain is geared towards protection because we don't have wings, we don't have claws, we can't run that fast. Our eyesight's not great. Like as a species in itself, we're not, we're pretty vulnerable as a species to the world. And so our brain is constantly looking for the threats, the dangers. And when we're in difficult situations, our brain can stop seeing the green flags in life and just start picking up on everything being a red flag. And if we don't actually practice intentionally finding green flags, everything starts looking like a red flag. And everything starts looking like I need to protect myself from this. Again, such a clever and such a wonderful protection mechanism, which has kept so many people alive and so many people, out from dangerous situations. It does come from at a cost though, right? It comes at a cost of now everything is painted red, and we don't actually recognize the green flags unless we go and intentionally try to look for those green flags. And for me, those green flags are joy, because if we're looking at centering trauma, that will always be the thing that we're trying to find. So that'll be the thing that we talk about. It's still, but if we center joy and healing, that is still part of it. And we're saying, how can we still hold both of those things as true?
Yeah, how can they coexist? I love what you say about not waiting for the trauma to be healed in order to re-engage with joy.
Yeah, exactly. And there's not much we do that way in life. You know, if I want to say learn a language, there's not a sense of I need to know my language perfectly before I can learn this language, right? Or I need to master every way. We just go, okay, I don't know this language, but maybe I can start small and, learn a few words. If it's me, I learn all the curse words first. And then I'm like, okay, now that I know all the curse words in this language, I can maybe start learning how to say hello in this language, My priority, learn all the curse words.
I
But
love that.
it's this thing of you start small when you want to learn something, when you want to move to a goal. If I want to, I don't know, run, God only knows why I would want to, but just say my goal was I want to run 10 Ks. Just know, Emma, that would never be me. But one day I wake up and I want to run 10 kilometers. I would not start by being like, okay, I need to know exactly all the ways to run and all the techniques. Maybe you are that person. That's okay. But part of it is, well, then go run. Maybe start walking. Maybe walk and run a little bit. Maybe, build that over time. It's how we kind of move towards a lot of goals in life that you might have. And so healing and joy is, I would say, very similar. Start, center it, find ways of finding it in different things. It's such a pity because I used to speak French more fluently than I speak English. There was a time I used to dream in French and think in French and whatever, and I've lost it. And I was in the French territories not that long ago, and I was like, oh God, I can't remember anything. But when I first came back to Australia from France, I would try to keep it alive by like naming all the different things in my house in French. Or if I was going to order something at a restaurant in my head, I would order it in French first before trying to order it in English or whatever that was. I was trying to keep it alive. I mean, that became too hard and not many people speak French here. So, that's fallen to the wayside. But it's this thing we know you either use it or you lose it. We understand that as a society for a lot of things, but I think we don't always understand that for joy. Right? And sometimes there's a sense of guilt that comes when there's difficulty and this thing of, oh, I shouldn't feel joyful or I shouldn't feel like we are literally watching a live stream genocide at the moment. Right. And there's so much of the sense of, I can't feel joy but there's this guilt that comes. I shouldn't. And I remember there's a quote by someone called Dan Savage who says, and this was a height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And he said, in the morning, we buried our friends. In the afternoon, we protested. And at night, we danced. And it was the dancing that kept us in the fight, and so keep dancing. And I think that's the point of we need to find joy to keep us in the fight, to continue to show up for each other and to continue to advocate and to keep us in the fight. And sometimes I think we lose that.
Yeah, and even more so when we are facing terrible things. If you don't have that, then I guess you die internally as well.
You lose hope, which is why ceremony and dancing and chanting and singing and weaving and art and making food together and poetry and expression is so important. Is so important, but I think capitalism has really robbed that from us and has really made it commodified this thing of, oh, I don't draw well, so I'm not good. And we forget it's not about drawing well, it's just about drawing. It's not about singing well, it's just about singing. It's not about, and if someone sings well, we go, oh, you should go on a show because you sing so well. What about them just singing for the joy of it? We've commodified so many things that I think it would be beautiful to go back to. Life is just supposed to be about finding moments of joy within moments of, I need to also survive.
Do you have any final words of wisdom for migrants out there who are struggling to belong or who are struggling in Australia in some ways?
You're not alone. I think that is one. You're not alone. There are so many people who feel this too and who really hold your experience and can really compassionately hold your experience. And if you can, really connecting with people in different ways might not always be the same ways that you have connected with people, but I find sport is a bloody brilliant way. And, someone might be like, well, I'm really bad at sport. I'm like, great, I suck at sport. Like, sure, in one sport I was good for a little while, but there were others. I played lacrosse for a long time. I was really bad at lacrosse. I don't, it wasn't good. But I played lacrosse, right? And it can be, or find a poetry kind of community, find a community you're interested in, and find spaces where you can authentically be yourself. Because the more you can learn to authentically be yourself, the more you can perhaps learn to authentically connect with others and be held compassionately.
That's a beautiful advice. Is there a book or any other piece of content that particularly inspired you that you would like to recommend?
I always think it's important to show First Nation voices. And there's this book called Firefront, and it's First Nation poetry and power today. And it's different essays. And I just love how much it really comes back to land and connection. And I think so many migrants could find those stories of your own connection to land that you might be missing into your own communities. And yeah, I found a lot of joy reading this book, Firefront.
And is there a guest that you would love to hear on this podcast?
Yeah, I don't know if you have already had Keishi Ilakramish,
No.
but I think Keishi would be wonderful to have on the podcast.
Great. Okay, let's chat after this. So, I have two sets of questions that I ask at the end of the interview. And the first one is, when I say the word migrant, what does it evoke in you? What words come to mind?
Strength, endurance, joy, and deep hope.
And my last question, which actually might be a set of questions, is about belonging. And as someone who's a BIPOC immigrant who also identify as queer, non-binary, neurodivergent, like we talked about, that you had to code switch quite a bit. So is there a place where you feel like you can authentically be yourself, where you don't need to code switch?
It's not a physical place, but it's my marriage, which is really beautiful because I was talking about this today, and all parts of myself are really welcome and celebrated. And it is also a place where my joy is celebrated and protected. And so, yeah, there is deep, deep, belonging, deep belonging and joy in my marriage.
I love that. At a macro level, do you feel home in Australia?
No,
No.
no. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think I love going back to India a lot, and we've talked about maybe moving there. Yeah, but it does feel much more like home there. But even still, I haven't found it yet. I think for a long time, for me, home was Cap Breton or La Hossegor, around those areas, just because I spent so much of my formative years there. But I don't actually know now.
Mm. For those who don't know, Osegor is in the
Oh,
south
yes.
of France. That's why you assumed I knew it.
Yes, sorry.
Because
Yes.
no one knows about Osegor. I'm
Yes,
telling you
this is
that.
a very good it's a very good point.
So,
Yes.
for people who would love to keep in touch with everything that you are doing, where can they follow you and contact you?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn as Mish Kumar-Jonson, not Mishma. I'm only ever called Mishma when I'm in trouble.
Oh,
with
sorry.
my life.
I did call you
Oh,
Mishma.
no, it's so fine. So that's why I just go by Mish, because I hear Mishma and I'm like, oh God, I have done something. So Mish Kumar-Jonson, and also on Instagram, Mish Kumar-Jonson as well.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, Mish, that was amazing to have a conversation with you. Niharika was right. You had so many insights that were so worth discussing. And thank you so much for sharing all of these interesting views. I have so much to reflect on.
No, and thank you for having me and just, creating the space to yarn and yap and chat and kind of go down rabbit holes. And yeah, thank you so much.
I loved all the rabbit holes that we've had. Thank you.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If the story and insights of this brilliant guest resonated with you, please share this episode with a friend, leave us a review, or add stars in the rating of the show. And don't forget to follow us, it helps the community grow. Next week, I will be interviewing Nouria Mehabi, who's a former refugee from Afghanistan and a senior clinician at the New South Wales Service for the Treatment and Rehabilitation of Torture and Trauma Survivors, more commonly called STARTS. She'll be giving plenty of mental health insights for refugee populations, so stay tuned. I was your host, Emma Bellamy, and I cannot wait to bring you on another journey from there to here.